I was running down the halls listening to the distant, psychotic dismay of her thoughts. She was screaming out to me, trying to get my attention. The halls were long, white-walled, and high-roofed, and they had security booths and steel bar checkpoints to ensure that none of the patients could escape, or that no one from the outside could get in. It reminded me of a hospital as I walked past an abandoned stretcher that was up on a raised platform, resting on wheels that were in a locked position to prevent it from rolling away on its own. The distinctive smell of the disinfectants in latex gloves encoded every object in the hallway. I stopped to think, clenching my eyes shut as I asked in ambience what direction it was that I had to take. I hung a left, skidding down the halls with added speed. There were no windows but for tiny, narrow barred openings at the top of the furthest walls, which were the only indicators to remind me that the outside world was in the midst of the night. "Hey, visiting hours are over," a man shouted as I passed another intersection. I heard his feet rapidly padding down the hall in pursuit of me as I ran around the corner. "Sir," he shouted, "you need to stop, sir." I stopped, turned on my heel to face the man. He was a rather wide, black-skinned male in a blue security suit, with a cheap shiny badge pinned to the left side of his shirt. He looked around as though wondering where it was that I had come from, and if I had an accompanying parent. "I can't have you go down that way." "Go back the way you came." "Have a good night now, sir," was all the man had said, as he turned back to the walk down the hallway he had just ran up. I pried into his tired mind, trying to map the shortest way through the building to where I had to go. I tested his memory, seeing if he knew the name of the patient that I was looking for, and where she was being held. He knew very little, and I was forced to work on my own. A strange sense of omniscience had occurred to me after I had taken my father's life. I had connected with something, though briefly. It was long enough for me to find her whereabouts. How such information came to me I could not understand, but it was there, laid before me, and I grabbed at it, imprinting it into my memory with unusual precision. I knew she was here. "Can I help you, little boy?" asked a lady who was seated behind a booth that had thick plexiglass separating her from me and a small cubic opening at the bottom of her to speak through. The late hours and the nearing end of her shift could be seen in the dark recesses of her eyes. Like most of the personnel, she was very tired and was prone to dispose my random appearance as a late-night hallucination. "Where is she?" I demanded, and before the lady could ask who it was I spoke of, I conjured a sudden image of her and surged it into the lady's mind, who fell back in her chair with a sudden look of shock across her face, as I tore the answer from deep within her memory centers. I ran on with my destination in tow. There was a security passage consisting of a set of barred gates and a slumbering guard beyond the bars, which slouched in a small black chair. He had the key to the gate, and I would need to go through him. I marched down the hall, keeping my mind focused on my target, hearing her outspoken cries for help, her abysmal sense of loss, her vanishing threads of hope. She needed me, and soon. "Wake up." The guard jumped out of his seat, throwing the clipboard in the air that previously rested in his lap. Hello?" the man asked loudly, startled by the unexpected appearance of a stranger. He spun his head in my direction, squinting as though he did not expect to see a boy in the confines of such a rehabilitation center. I grabbed onto the gate and tugged, feeling it firmly locked in place. I pressed my head partially through the bars and looked the guard in the eyes. "Open this gate," I commanded. I can't do that. I need clearance from—" "Open the gate," I said again, pressing harder from my mind. "You got it," he said in a nervous chatter, as he reached for the keys slung at his side. His clumsy, shaky hands dropped the set onto the floor with a loud clang, and another man beyond the gate came jogging around the corner. "Denzel, what you shouting about over there?" the man asked, while the guard under my influence sifted through his keys rapidly. Denzel hesitated, staring at me as though wondering what it was that he was doing. His friend's familiar voice was clawing at his sense of awareness, and my grasp on his subconscious grew weaker. The other guard had ran up to the gate and looked through the iron bars at me in the same confusion as Denzel. "What are you doing here, son?" asked the recently arriving guard, as his friend Denzel was returning to his senses, while lowering his set of keys back down onto his belt. "Step back." The two guards jumped back from the gate as though it was electrified, and I pressed my hands together, focusing on terrible, loathsome, and unforgiving emotions. After a short time, I unclenched my fingers from around another and pressed my hand against the key slot of the gate, feeling the sub-zero temperatures instantly freeze the inner workings of the lock. With a swift kick, I shattered the lock into dusty ice particles, and the two guards jumped to the ground at the violent sound of the shattering. I ran past them. "Hey, stop!" shouted Denzel as he chased after me, while his friend pulled out a short-range two-way radio from his belt clip and shouted frantically into its mouthpiece for backup. I ran down a hallway where every feet was a door to either side. They had tiny viewing glass windows that were reinforced with rebar, while the door itself was as thick as a bank vault and possessed nearly as many clever locking mechanisms. I didn't have to look into the tiny windows for her, as I could just as easily feel her presence, and I briefly stopped in front of each door to sense the being inside. The guard was catching up to me, and I projected an image of myself running down an adjacent hall. The slippery, black dress shoes on the feet of the guard skidded across the floor as he turned the other way, chasing after an illusion his mind convincingly produced. I passed by one door after another, finding nothing but the scattering thoughts of the occupants inside. Every one of the prisoners in the cells were strung by endless cords of emotion, bound by extremely potent and dominating conceptions of empathy that cast it out of their fragile bodies like wild, gushing fountains of radiant life that left nothing behind. Here was the people society had deemed insane, lost to our culture, and locked far away from public eyes, and yet they all held immeasurable amounts of awareness. In their overactive minds sat unconceivable sums of knowledge and understandings of the outer workings well beyond that of the greatest genius, but all was so maddening, and it drank away at their conscious reality until they slowly became lost in the oppressive demands of influential desires. I could hear her. Her thoughts so clear to me, their flowing harmonies, a welcoming familiarity. Ever since we had touched, and ever since our minds had bonded, I had come to understand everything about her, and even the now confused and muddled thoughts that ran about unchecked in her mind was a familiar and welcoming tune to my ears. She was 4 doors down. I ran by, passing the other doors on the way without care, as I now knew where she was. Her crazed thoughts grew in volume as I approached, and I was forced to keep my mind focused on the living world around me. A security guard was running down the hallway in my direction, and I nearly misled him in the other way with a simple thought, until I realized I needed a way to get into the holding cell. The guard came to a halt, 5 feet away from me, falling to his knees as I had demanded. I clutched onto his head, using the heightened telepathic benefits of touch, and an image of the correct key to the chamber appeared before me. I reached down, grabbing a hold of the ring of keys on his waist, as the guard stared blankly off into nothingness before he passed from the exertion his head had undergone. He slumped down onto his back as his now vulnerable mind fought for control. I found the correct key, with an ease that came along with repetitive and continuous practice of having used them from all the years that the guard had worked there, and I slipped it into the keyhole. I turned it, hearing a loud clank, and feeling the large latch from the inside of the door unbind from the wall. I opened it, and there she was. Cuddled in the corner of a cold and dark cell, she was wrapped up in her own arms as though sheltered herself from the outside. A terrible fear sat at the edge of her mind as she recalled her many failed attempts at suicide that had ultimately led her here. Miss Kendleton looked up at me, squinting as her eyes tried to overcome the sudden light that forced the darkness from within her room into retreat. She had finally recognized who I was. A great glowing sense of hope illuminated her face, and she ran over to me. "Derek, I thought I heard you coming. I knew I heard you coming," she spoke frantically, the words slipping off her tongue faster than she could breathe. "I wasn't sure if it was just the other voices always there, telling me there is no hope, telling me there's no reason to live." Miss Kendleton's face was shallow, as though she hadn't eaten since I had last seen her, and her thoughts were no longer careful of the meticulous practicalities of her over-formal college teachings. In fact, she wasn't even in tune with society anymore. The surface of her mind continued to sink upon itself. Even as she looked up at me with a sense of glimmering hope, she soon fell back down to the ground, weeping in despair as a great sense of emptiness overcame her. Even in this state, Miss Kendleton fought on, her conscience self-pressing itself to the surface that she might be able to speak to me, knowing this was an opportunity she had dreamed of, something she thought would never have occurred. "Derek, I know it all now. I've seen it all. You've shown me it, and I understand." She quickly reached for my arm, and it went numb with coldness at her touch. She recoiled back, scrambling back into the corner of the room as her mind fell into a terrible spiral of decadence. She began to cry fanatically, clutching at her own eyes as though she wished to blind herself, and pulling at her tongue in the belief that she could silence the screams. I ran over to her, grabbed onto her shoulder as she screamed louder in dismay, as though my touch was only making things worse. I looked down at my necklace, which fell out of my shirt from the rapid motion. I grabbed a hold of it with my other hand, its warmth purging the numbness in my arm, and instantly silencing Miss Kendleton. We remained quiet. In a sphere of silence in the sound-proofed chamber filtered out the noise of running occupants throughout the building. "Derek," she whispered, snapping out of a moment's silence. "She is in you, Derek, and you have to get rid of her." "I know," I told her, stepping away as I heard the guards coming down the hall through the open cell door that allowed local noise to seep in. It was just like the warrior had said. There was no other way. With a single thought, the door closed behind me, and I sealed its lock, freezing its internals that no key may enter. "You have to help me," I said, realizing there wouldn't be another time. I had to do it. It was to be done here and now, and I knew well of all the risks. I had made my goodbyes. I had said farewell to the ones I loved, and even made a departing wave to the setting sun. I was ready for this. The warrior had said it was the only way it could be done, and I would heed his every word. Miss Kendleton looked up at me in wonder. Even though she was given a brief moment of clarity, she could not possibly understand how she could be of any help to me. When she suddenly realized what I was asking, fear struck her in a sharp, startling realization, as she was provoked to terminate the last thread of hope she had. "Kill me," I whispered, and Miss Kendleton unwillingly rose from the ground. I drove the thought deeply into her mind, repeating the words again and again as her limbs moved against her will. She gently wrapped her arms around my throat, something I had been growing far too accustomed to, and suddenly, in a violent jolt, threw my body to the ground, clenching at it feverishly as she gave into the full force of my will. Tears poured out of my eyes, dripping across my face as she came to the understanding that it had to be done. I grasped for breath, all the while feeling the crushing sensation of guilt clawing at Kathy's mind as she knew she was killing me. The familiar embrace of death threaded its way throughout my suffocating body and promised a sweet release. I held on to my necklace with both hands and welcomed the coming darkness. Grayish clouds of mist swept across the invisible ground, gathering in collective swirls, twirling as though in a dance to commemorate the absence of life. Streams of blue frost carried in their winds, clattering their cold and hollow surfaces as they gathered together, stretching into a long and thin veil of darkness. The mist had vanished, and she walked out of its graces. I stood my ground and stared straight ahead into the emptiness as she glided over the dimming stars and around to my side. Her cold breath pressed against my neck as she circled around me, staring into me as though to see what it was that I was thinking. "What is it, Derek?" she hissed. The rattling of ice resounded from deep within her throat. "Are you trying to die? Is that what you want?" I closed my eyes, breathing in the cold, desolate air of the universe around me. It was time I took action. "No," I told her, looking down into the worlds that orbited the numerous stars below, before I spoke aloud my thoughts. "I want you to die." She turned suddenly, staring at me with orbs of blackness, her cape of shadows flowing out from behind her as though a gust of wind had struck her. "And I came here to kill you." I swung at her, knowing no other way to take her down, and she vanished, appearing quickly behind me. I was thrown to the ground, and I turned over onto my back, to quickly face her again. "Kill me?" She laughed hysterically, as though in audience of a joke. "You cannot do that, child. It was I who conceived you." I stood back up, facing her terrible wrath, staring into her deep, pearlescent eyes, which had brought me to my knees for so long. "Lies," I stated, calmly, avoiding any radical emotions that may turn things in her favor. She raised her arm as blue condensation fell from below her outstretched limb, and ice formed across its surface. "I can take you away as fast as I brought you here." I'm sorry, that's the wrong person. "I can take you away as fast as I brought you here," she warned, and then flung her hand into my direction, casting out hundreds of tiny icicles that darted at me at alarming speed. My hand gripped tightly against my necklace as I lowered my head, clenching my eyes shut until I heard the shattering sounds of ice. I opened them again and watched as the crystal daggers splashed against an invisible field that stretched out a few inches around me. Their shattered forms floated helplessly in air before they slowly fell back to their master and gathered around her arm again. She lowered her hand, realizing the futility of her efforts. Her face turned down, coiling in dismay as she began to give in to the very same emotion that she had forced upon humanity. Hopelessness. "What is it that you want, Derek?" Her voice was calm, almost in apologetic fashion. Her heartless gaze still pierced through me like the cold steel tip of a blade, but she no longer posed a threat. She was willing to negotiate. "What are you?" I asked. She looked around as though just consciously taking in her surroundings. The galaxy below us remained still. The endless stars that encoded the tail fins of the spiraling nebulas were flickering, as though offering their silent opinions. "There is no word for me that could be spoken on such a primitive tongue, such as the one you possess." She remained unusually still, giving up all the human gestures and postures that she had acted out for so long. Her mouth didn't even move to her words. It just hung open as she spoke. "Why do you look like my mother?" I asked, nervous in anticipation of the answer. "My image is your own making. My words are of your choosing. This form was meant to be comforting to you." "But you're not," I whimpered, witnessing the terrible mockery of my mother. "That is because you see through eyes that are not your own. The truth cannot be hidden from you, as you were designed to resist the temptations of my kind." And what are your kind?" I asked, pressing for more, hoping dearly my time here was not limited, that my living form would remain alive just long enough for me to hear what I needed. Something strange told me this being was not simply buying time, or hoping for myself to fade or die off. It was caught in its deception, and that field of deceit was stripped away. She hesitated. Something I did not know such a thing as herself could do. "What are you?" I yelled at her, stepping closer. "Why don't you come out? Stop being somebody else. Stop trying to look like my mother." "I had told you before. What I am just a figure of your imagination. I have no living form, but what you deal with here is just a fraction of my entirety. A nightmare that even a mind like yours, crafted by a race far older than your own, could not possibly bear." I stepped back, walking across the groundless surface, peering out into the expanding galaxy. "I have consumed thousands of civilizations since the birth of this galaxy, and only one had ever been so foolish to assume it could resist me." I could hear distant whispers. I looked around at my feet, crouching to the ground and pressing my ear against the dark backdrop of the galaxy as the cries grabbed for my attention. As I leaned down, hovering the side of my head over the transparent surface that I kneeled upon, my necklace had hung below my ear. The angels were speaking to me. "That jewel you bear mocks you as the star child of an ancient race, and your blood flows with a current that is not far from my own." "God," I whispered. "Where is he?" "Where is he?" I shouted, lifting my head up the moment the angels went silent. I heard what they had said. I had heard their request. I knew what I needed to do. Her eyes shook as her head turned sharply, the first sign of movement since I had originally confronted the entity. It knew exactly what I spoke of. "Leave it!" she commanded, a sense of hostility returning to her voice. "No! He could save them! He could save us all!" "Foolish child, you make your own delusions. There is no God. He is alive, a false creation, a sick mockery of my kind." "You lie!" I shouted. The emerald gem at the center of my necklace slowly hummed with life. "You're the one who can see the truth. Why not open your eyes to it? Realize the deception that creation has placed over you." She pointed to the necklace that hung at my necklace. "That false god is no different than I and the other species knew the truth of it. Why else was it cast from the bowels of their torn world, scorned by their misled culture, and thrown into the emptiness of the galaxy?" I felt it come alive. The emotion that was wounding her, the very thing that had been hurting her all along. It had always been there for man, given form to help them overcome her terrible influence, to starve her from her insatiable appetite. It was the emotion, given to mankind in order to help us resist such a terrible entity, and it had been here all along. It was Faith. The polar opposite of what she was. With every glint of hope, every uplifting brow, with every aspiring dream, her form would fade away. She strove against it, for she fed from the hopelessness of man. She drank endlessly of the lost ambitions of mankind, and brought with her the terrible affliction of unsettled depression. Her appetite was filled by the dying cries of a life that sulked in the thought of being forever alone. She was what past cultures and religions would deem a demon. She was wrong when she had said that there was no word that could be spoken as to what she was, for I had found the very one term that explained it all. She was despair. It was a terrible, plaguing emotion that burdened mankind, but it was not without cure. She sought to blind me, to bring me under some loathsome spell that infected many. She wanted to smother it, the flame that was called faith, the conjuring deity that threatened to dispel her influential decree of hopeless abandonment, and her brief connection to me had revealed it all. If men remained united under a single deity, then there was no way she could win. I knew what I had to do now. Clinging firmly to the emotion, I held Faith at my forefront, spewing energetic fumes of hope that forced her foul form to back away.
You will regret this, child of man, son of a false god. I am more than you can possibly imagine.
Clinging to the necklace that hung loosely at my neck, I could hear the distant voices singing of a great burial ground. It was a place that was long forgotten by man, though lost when the age of science had burst upon the world. I looked down into the galaxy, a glowing distant star calling to my attention. I knew she was watching me with her cold and apathetic eyes. She was waiting for it, waiting for me to discover it all. Even with all that I had learned, there was so much more that I could not understand. There were truths and lies, and they all looked identical to me, as they fabricated stories beyond realistic comprehension. It was time I stopped asking questions, and started making up answers. The stars blared in bright streaming lights as I passed them at a speed no mortal being could ever achieve. Worlds, cultures, and civilizations passed by me in the blink of an eye, as I was carried towards a world created by the minds of man and the souls of the faithful. I watched as the reaching tendrils of the glowing nebulas reached out to feed from these passing life forms, victimizing them just as they had my own species. The world was coming to me, and it strangely looked familiar. It took the appearance of Earth, as great fields of swaying grass blew gently on the warm currents of air that were blessed by the sun's orange glow, which would have always loomed overhead. Tall mountains climbed into the skies, surrounding the open field like great sheltering walls that kept out the prying eyes of those who sought to defile such sacred lands. This was the fields of Elysium, the open lands of Shangri-La, the palace of Arcadia, or the gates of the heavens. It had undergone many names in the lifetime of man, but it all had meant the same thing. It was our creation, a spiritual afterlife, a promised land where the faithful would then be returned. A great towering pillar rose from the ground into the far reaches of the sky, its surface carved inscriptions of long-forgotten languages and distant, embellished prophecies. A great energy radiated from the runic stone, as the prayers of every living being drizzled from the clouds above and landed harmoniously into the crevices of its angelic surface. I could hear them all, the short utterances of gratefulness that spoke kind words of appreciation, in the assumption that a greater being had brought such fortune to their lives. I could hear their solemn requests, their pleading for assistance, and their determined need for some kind of guidance for them to overcome a disease or to overturn an addiction. They needed the inspiration to believe. Even the curses came through, the last fruitless determination that such a being mustn't exist, for why else had their lives become what it had? How could such tragedy befall such a faithful person if there truly was a God? Had their lives always been just a lie? All of their words fell short, landing upon a large tomb that lay before the glowing obelisk. I walked over to the tomb, observing the same glowing sigils from the spire, carved into its stone surface. It was massive, and what it carried inside was beyond even my omniscience. As I slid my hand across its surface, the denials and the hated curses all grew louder in volume. I could hear her laughter in the background, as the negativity fed into her massive appetite. She was growing in power, and with every short-lived belief and every loss of faith, she grew nearer.
I have found you.
Her voice was piercing cold, and the grass behind me instantly became encased in ice. I turned frantically in the direction of the open field and watched as the grass shattered in its fragile form, turning into a glacial sea. A part of the earth had fallen away, the tall mountains behind the pillars of faith fall beneath the horizon, swallowed by an unforeseen undercurrent that then threw their snowy peaks out into the blackness of the galaxy. The ground trembled as large rocky structures tumbled from the protective mountains and crashed into the fleshy, green surfaces of the earth. Purple currents that carried remorse and dread on their wings flew out from the giant wound within the earth, and a large roar, deeper than the cracking sound of the tectonic plates, resounded from the bottomless pit. The dark, gaseous clouds spread out across the sky, gathering around the rays of the star, suffocating the earth from the light. The creature, the size of a continent, rose from the sunken lands, pulling itself up from beneath the earth, using the severed crust of the planet as a leverage for its climb into this reality. Its massive, scythe-like arms pierced into the ground as it tore itself out from the center of the planet. I wanted to take a step back, but I somehow doubted such a menial effort would make any difference to the matter. 4 purple demonic wings splayed out from the back of the creature, smothering the sky in its gaping span and blocking out the sun that had nurtured the land for so long.
You wanted to see me, Star Child?
The monster continued to rise from the earth. Its black flesh was covered in thick hides of layered ice, its breath deathly cold, and its face was a shallow, shapeless void, as it refused to express any emotion beyond dismay. Sharp and bony edges spiked from its multi-jointed limbs, covered in a metallic reflective sheen that was as slick as ice.
I had warned you before, Derek Kaon. I am something you could never possibly conceive.
This was it, the heart of the beast, the part I was obligated to destroy. But how the hell do I go about that? The ice below me was cracking, and I shuffled around the weakening surfaces, leaping onto the icebergs that displayed more promising integrity. I watched as a segment of the ice was pulled away, brought into the soil of the earth, and a faint sight of fingers could be prying out of the ground. Soon all around me the ice was melting, shattering to pieces from the hands that hammered at them from below the ground. Arms stretched out of the earth, swaying around as though looking for leverage to pull out their bodies from within the earth. I ran over the nearest set of hands, grabbing a hold of them and pulling hard until a head had appeared out of the loose turf, like the birth of an infant, into a new world. The man climbed onto the ground, briefly wiping himself off the dirt before kneeling to me, muttering a praise in some other language. His darker skin and facial tone said that he was Hispanic, but nevertheless, he was a servant to belief, and he was the pressing image of his deity. And I was the pressing image of his deity. All around me, men, women, and children climbed out of the ground, staring upon me as though I was some brilliant, captivating image. All the while, not a single one of them had taken notice of the Primordian of despair that continued to climb out of the crust of the earth. When I looked back upon the rising creature, it was then that the people had given their attention to it, and to my disbelief, they stood before it, unflinchingly. Massive arms uncurled around the demon, previously confining it like a restraint jacket, but now they threatened to consume life, as great scythes were shaped at the end of them and were lifted high into the air.
Succumb to despair, for I am the end of days.
The blades were brought down, shattering the ground and cracking its surface where shards of ice ruptures from the canyons, carved by the scythes like blood gushing from a wound. Men, women, and children scurried in terrifying fear, their sense of reality awoken by the sudden hostility of the creature, and their previously unfaltering statures of faith quickly was whisked away, in witness of the horrifying destruction the beast had unleashed before them. Hundreds were dying, their souls consumed by the lavishing tongues that salivated frozen droplets at the end of the hungry scythes. The blades drank endlessly from the casting hopelessness that afflicted all, as people cried out to a god that simply was not there. I ran up a series of stone granite stairs where rested a coffin at the top, neatly perched before the rising obelisk. The Primordian of Despair, as though reading my very thoughts, knew of my immediate intentions, and brought out one of its massive blades. I stopped on my heels and turned the other way, as though I stood a chance of making it out of range of its massive sweep. I could feel the whooshing cold air as the blade was brought down onto the earth, and then a loud, sparking zap sounded to my rear, and I turned to risk a look. The scythe had intended to take my life, slid across a massive sphere that radiated outward from the obelisk, and I was at the edge of that protective force field. Realizing I was covered by this energetic sphere, I turned back, running toward the pillar once again, staring up at the scythe as it raised into the air again, only to strike back down rapidly in the opening fields at the scurrying people who poured into this world. The eyes of the Primordian darted across the land, catching sight of all the fleeing, terrified people whose lives it could drink from and bring to consummated misery. It was so primal in its instincts, it could not pry its attention from the feast ahead of it, and I begun to recognize the significance of all the people. I had wondered what they could possibly do, what mortal men in this unfamiliar world could do against such a vast and unstoppable entity. I began to blame myself, assuming that I must have somehow brought them here, by some subconscious cry that I wasn't even aware that I was making. But that was not true. They were all here on their own accord, making the gallant sacrifice they had long promised in their devoted faith to a distant god. They were here to give me the time that I had needed to reach the sacred tomb.
They die all because of you, Derek.
The maniacal laughter of the Primordian echoed in my head as it continued to attack my psyche. It would never quit. It would always try to bring me down. It would always fill me with its lies. I ran up the stone granite stairs that led up to the elevated basin. The large rectangular stone box was massive, and I stood little chance of opening it. I pressed at its surface, looking for some kind of hidden switch or lever that might be concealed in its runic design, but I found nothing. I kicked at its top, hoping I could make it budge, as all I needed to do was slide it off its base, but even that seemed impossible for a boy such as I. The Primordian continued to drink from the fields of the devoted, and all I could do was fiddle with this stupid coffin. I gave up, and sat down against the stone box with my back pressed against its surface. Another sweep of the scythe carved a massive gash into the planet, and the screams of the dying echoed out over the blood-soaked fields. What a terrible creature it was. To be set on one such thing as that, the folly and decadence of man, how horrible of a thing it was. And the fact that it had been there by my side, since the beginning, was more disturbing than the slaughter that occurred in front of my eyes. What part did I play in it all, and how much did I contribute to its terrible form? I shook my head, ridding such thoughts from my mind, knowing it only fed the hungering creature's desire to spread hopelessness across all humanity. Was it alone? Was it the only one? Could we even stop such a creature, and if then, what could there be? Only happiness and bliss, a life of perfection? I would like to believe it, but then I recalled all the haunting imagery of my past dreams, and knew that it was not by itself, that it had kin, it spoke of them itself, it was an entity, a species unto itself, and it held a spiteful malice to its siblings, as it rivaled for its grip on humanity. I had seen its brothers, and they had fought each other over a simple promise. I remember the great winged demon that came to my call, its open willingness to kill the blighted mutant at the heart of a tumor. They would just as easily turn on themselves, and I almost considered reaching out to one, but I didn't know how to call it, or how to even find them. I wasn't even sure if I was willing to make whatever dire sacrifice it would surely demand, but then again, it all didn't matter, as I didn't know their names or their callings, and without such directed titles, how could I possibly summon them? Or did I know the name of one? I rose from the ground, turning to the great coffin, and placing my hands atop its surface.
You will regret this.
I recalled the words.
Son of Shal Ruahan.
I pressed my lips against its stone surface, its sigils glowing from a mellow yellow to an illuminated orange, and then to an enlightening red. I hoped dearly this would work. I prayed that it would work. I was able to hear my own prayer as it fell from the dark purple sky through the midst of the ongoing slaughter and straight into the coffin beneath my hands. Shal, I began. The stones beneath my feet began to rattle. Ru. The world shuddered. The great Primordian of despair turned its awful gaze at me, flaring its wings into the air and lifting its massive scythes to strike. Ahain. A searing heat flowed through my body as I lurched backwards. falling down the granite stairway that led to the tomb. I clutched frantically at my chest as the growing sensation of heat grew to immeasurable levels, and the gem at the center of my necklace fired out sporadic bolts of electricity in every direction. My body shook violently. I could not focus my vision. I slowly saw the lowering scythes, the great black demon in the distance, narrowing its emotionless eyes in my direction. The pressure was immense, and I had to let it out. I lowered my jaw and fell onto my back as the heat of a sun surged out of my throat and pierced into the sky above. Streaks of lightning curled up the narrow beam of light that fired out of my open mouth and eviscerated the clouds above while my body hung loosely at the end of the light, like a strung-up rag doll, lifelessly bound to the force of the hand above it. An immeasurable sensation of omnipotence overcame my limbs, and a sweeping scythe was severed from one of the demon's arms as it crossed over the beam of light above me. A terrible screech was released from the foul form of the Primordian, but its echo had been silenced by the tranquil winds that escaped from the open coffin. Out of the sky came a bolt of lightning that soared through the air with the graces of a dove flying above a calm tundra, oblivious to the cold death below. The spark that had floated above silenced everything that had carried over the winds, and the world was left with the subtle humming of the traveling light. It landed in the fields where now thousands had lain slain, and its glittering reflective light expanded until it was about the length of a giant and molded itself into the shape of a humanoid. Massive wings splayed from the back of the divine being whose flesh glowed white, as though shining like the heart of a star, threatening to blind the eyes of any onlookers. The sight of such a thing was incredible, and all those who remained alive, who were scattered at the far edges of the field, looked upon the being in devout commitment to forever uphold its name. Radiant streaks of lightning fired off of its flesh, reaching out into the skies, which rained the powerful bolts back down onto the Primordian of Despair, that now tore at the earth below it, fighting to embed itself back into the safety of the planet's crust. Great runes cast across the entire entity's frozen body, tearing off chunks of flesh that crystallized into ice and then shattered into seamless glass as it hit the ground below it. The wave of hopeless despair was in retreat, and it was replaced with an over-bountiful sense of hopeful faith. As the demonic creature that had plagued my life screeched its way back into the crevice of the earth, the being constructed of divine light walked across the open field, resurrecting the falling bodies it carefully stepped over. It passed through the fields of people who were now liberated from their previous fright, yet refused to cast their eyes on something of such magnitude. They all kneeled and bowed, as the god being took gigantic steps in my direction, its massive form seemingly weightless, as each step refused to shake the ground below it. I sat on the earth, exhausted from the energy that had passed from the tomb into me and then into the sky. Even this world, where one would unlikely tire, I was brought to fatigue and I could not hold myself up. The ground below me grew back the grass that had been there, and I rubbed my hands over it in bliss, trying to recall what it was like to live again. I wanted to remember the simple sensation of life again. A great light shone over me as the divine being took a massive step in front of me, and lowered itself to a knee. Ecstatic wings shone with brilliance as they climbed over the high head of the god entity, streaks of lightning passing through their floating streams of white fibers, which waved lightly through the air as though gravity was no factor to them. A hand, in the shape of that of a man, reached out from the being. Its flesh was covered in the same blinding white light as the rest of the body, and one could only see the outline of the hand. As the details were lost in the powerful projection of its vibrancy, it reached out to me, its energies leaching into my tired body, radiating into the air, and rejuvenating my limbs with incredible vigor. It spoke to me. Its voice was majestic. Its words were calming. It spoke with a voice that had a lifetime of understanding, a tone that could calm even the most riled of creatures, a gentleness that warmed the soul and healed the heart. "Thank you," it said, "my son." Water was pouring out of the keyhole as the guard's shaky hand slipped the key into its port. They turned to share a look of confusion, as they could not understand how so much water could have been within the lock. A look of confusion, which has been present the entirety of the night. Denzel put his hand on the door handle and slowly began to pull. The two security guards stood in place, watching as the woman that was recently imported into the institution was strangling the boy that was reported running through the halls at the center of the chamber. Denzel and his partner jumped into action, grabbing onto her arms and pulling her off with the child without much effort. The maddened woman went limp, and she refused to resist them, and Denzel reached for the radio that hung at the side of his utility belt. He clicked it into channel, and shouted into its mouthpieces a series of numbers that indicated the cell block and chamber where they were. Several nurses appeared at the opening of the cell door, stopping at its entrance when they saw the strangled child on the floor of the cell. Gasps and exclamations were made as one of the nurses raised her hand to her mouth, as though to keep her words of shock. "Need some help over here," Denzel shouted, as he pinned Miss Kendleton to the ground, who was not showing any signs of resistance, as she stood blankly towards the roof of the chamber. Denzel didn't know how long she'd remain like that, and he waved forward a nurse, gesturing for her to retrieve a sedative that would subdue Kathy, had she chose to attack again. The remaining nurse ran over to the boy, and lightly pressed her hands against his neck for a few seconds before she snapped her hands back, pressing them against her chest in shock as she realized the boy was dead. Both guards held on to the arm of Miss Kendleton, who was pinned against the far wall, her face void of life. Denzel shouted to the nurse, asking of the boy's condition, and all he got back was a slow nod that confirmed that he was dead. The nurse, in her attempt to distract herself from the corpse of the child, ran over to help the guards, speaking calmly to Kathy, trying to get her attention back to reality. More feet could be heard outside the cell door, and a nurse carrying an open syringe ran in cautiously, with her eyes carefully watching where she pointed the tip of the needle. She was running to the patient, who was being calmly spoken to by a nurse assistant, while two security guards held tightly onto her arms, catching their breath from having ran around the asylum after a boy who now lay dead in the chamber. The personnel were yelling over each other, trying to establish a form of order while requests were being sent out over the shortwave radios. More people piled into the chamber, carrying a stretcher to apprehend the violent subject, while several medical specialists dressed in stainless white robes ran over to the corpse of the boy. The administering nurse's hand shook violently as she tried to straighten the syringe to guide it into the arm of the patient, who was held by Denzel, the security guard. She stopped when her subject, who was previously staring off into the roof, then realigned her face to look past her with mesmerized eyes. The guards and the two nurses all turned to see what she was looking at, and watched as the medical team rose from their perched position beside the fallen boy and took several steps back. The strangle victim of Kathy Kendleton rose from the cold surface of the cell, without the help of any of the personnel around him. The complexions and face returned, and a healthy glow settled beneath his skin, as he looked through the room and into the eyes of Miss Kendleton. The guards released Kathy, stepping back into the corners of the room, as the nurses too fell back with the security team, making way for the boy with the bicolored and radiant eyes to make his way to her. A strange sense of enlightenment dawned over the watching souls of the occupants inside the chamber, none of which who could understand the essence of it. The shock of the boy's sudden return to life was but a faint, flickering candlewick flame in comparison to the majestic divinity that burned like a bright star in the eyes of the child. He walked over to Kathy Kendleton and placed his small, gentle fingers underneath her chin to lift her soaked eyes up to his. "You're free now," the boy had said, and Mrs. Kendleton's sanity returned to her. As though it was a wounded tendril to that of a beast that had many more, the astral form of this ancient life unwound itself from the planet it held onto so dearly. Its nebular body constricted once again, realizing that it had outstretched itself, and that even with an endless lifetime of wisdom, it had made a mistake. It would take time for it to recover, to rebuild what it had lost, and until then, its influence would be unmet. Now, with the primordial life retreating from the earth, the populace that was bred on the surface had a chance to heal again, and an opportunity to overcome the scar that marked its surface. But not for long, as the growth of another life drank from the freed and open airs of the planet, and the careless emotions of man that ran wild. Now that it was no longer repressed by the primordial life that had previously kept it at bay, it was free to take its reign.